Welcome, everyone. My name is Dana White. What a beautiful afternoon we have today. We have such a special Myth Salon on synchronicity today, and already the day has been filled with synchronicities. So, the first thing I would like to do is just, have a moment of silence as we welcome ourselves in. We are making leaps and bounds progress with the coronavirus. There's no way to say that we're out of the woods yet, but we can actually take a trip. We can get vaccinated. There are many of us who have had our first and second vaccinations. And in a week, my wife and I will get on the plane for the first time in more than a year. We're going to go visit my mom in Hawaii. So I would like to just open it up today, have a quick moment of silence for the people who are no longer here. They didn't make it through the coronavirus. So, all right, let's get ourselves oriented here. I'm particularly troubled these days about the amount of abuse that various ethnicities and nationalities have been experiencing. And it just completely surprises me that Asian Americans would in some way be singled out as a population group. I personally have always sort of romanticized the East. But I have a poem that I would like to bring in today by a San Francisco poet, I believe. Her name is Marilyn Chin. We are Americans now. We live in the tundra. Today in hazy San Francisco, I face seaward toward China, a giant begonia, pink, fragrant, bitten by verdigris and insects. I sing her a blues song. Even a Chinese girl gets the blues. Her reticence is black and blue. Let's sing about the extinct Bengal tigers, about the giant pandas. Ling Ling loves Jing Jing, yet we will not mate. We are not impotent, we are important. We blame the environment, we blame the zoo. What shall we plant for the future? Bamboo, sassafras, coconut palms? No. Legumes, wheat, maize, old swine to milk the new. We are Americans now. We live in the tundra of the logical, a sea of cities, a wood of cars. Farewell, my ancestors, hirsute Taoists, failed scholars, farewell. My wet-nurse who feared and loathed the Catholics who called out, now that the half-men have occupied Canton, hide your daughters, lock your doors. So as we surround ourselves with otherness, let's all be others. Let's give space to those among us who feel the footsteps that we are walking, and let's try walking in somebody else's footsteps and create a path of compassion as we go forward. Let's see if we can find some companions on this trip. So, Will, why don't you take it from here and let's have ourselves a good time with Joe Cambray and with Christoph and Chris Vogler and the rest of the panelists and everybody attending. Wonderful. Welcome, everyone.
Thanks, Dana. Looking forward to a really cool, really awesome event. And, hopefully there'll be some twists and turns as is the one when we're talking about synchronicity. But before I get started and before I introduce the panel, as I usually do, I want to share a few announcements and express some gratitude. First and foremost, I want to thank everyone for being here. It's because y'all keep coming that we keep going. And I want to thank the Pacifica Alumni Association for always supporting these Myth Salons and for supporting this particular duo of events, starting with the event with Jeff Kripal a couple weeks ago. I want to thank Michael Wiese Productions. Michael Wiese Productions is the leading publisher of books on film, and it's a real honor that they've decided to elevate these events to their audience. So thank you. And thank you to Chris Vogler for being here to reinforce our effort to bring more myth to more storytellers. And with that, I've got to give some thanks to AJ. I didn't tell him I was going to do this. Y'all might not know AJ, but AJ, can you turn on your camera for just a second? This is who makes this website look so good, and who's been making all these tremendous portals, and who's been managing the newsletters and all these things. So I just want to say thank you to AJ for all of your incredible work. And I'm going to show off some of your work now. And Dana, I think that the portal share, or that the screen share is going to work for me. Let's see here. This is the Transformational Narrative Portal family. And so these are, first of all, the Transformational Narrative. For those of you who may not be familiar, just looking for a way to draw a circle around individuation and the hero's journey, and rites of passage and screenplay, and how to sell something and how to go on an adventure. These are all these narrative processes, narratives of transformation. And I believe that they should all be in dialogue with one another, that those that are studying it from the point of view of individuation as a depth psychologist have a lot to share with those who are just engaging transformational patterns from the perspective of a screenwriter, and vice versa. Some of the greatest mythologists of the last century have been storytellers like Tolkien. So you'll find opportunity to dive deep into various transformational narratives. We'll continue to add to them. And I just want to point you to one that's particularly relevant to today to get us started. This is the one for individuation, and which is, as we'll find, very related to synchronicity. And you can find some information. Basically here, you'll just see various sources of information, sources of basically Wikipedia, encyclopedia entries. But so many people don't get past Wikipedia. And we really want to point people past Wikipedia by curating high quality resources that you can dig into to find out more about individuation. Click here and check out do a deep dive into the video content around individuation. And you can go deeper here into information on Carl Jung, individuation, synchronicity, and the man of the hour today, Joe Cambray. So if you'd like to find out more or explore more around individuation, synchronicity, Joe Cambray. Also, we have one for Chris Vogler and the writer's journey. Check out the website, check out these portals, and go in some deep dives if you have further interest than we get into tonight. So thank you all for indulging me to show y'all for just a moment what that's about. We're really excited about those. And we believe that they're incredible resources for storytellers, for educators, for psychologists, and especially, of course, for mythologists. So with that, let's dive in. Let's dive into the panel. You all know Dana White, who's a scholar, author, host of this Myth Salon, and contributing faculty at Pacifica Graduate Institute. My name is Will Lynn. I'm the founder of Myth House and the General Education Department at Huston College, where I teach myth to filmmakers and performing artists. We're also joined by Dr. Dennis Patrick Slattery, a mythology scholar, poet, longtime professor in Pacifica's doctoral program in mythology, and a prolific author. To check out his books and tours and events, you're going to want to visit DennisPatrickSlattery.com, which, when it's shared below, you know it's AJ. Selena Matthews is a clinical psychologist, author, and keynote speaker who graduated from Pacifica and has been an ever-present participant and supporter of the Myth Salon. She is the CEO of Soul Transformation Seminars. Zaman Stanizai is professor of mythology and political science at Pacifica and Cal State, a poet, linguist, mystic, and Fulbright scholar. He has written extensively on a wide range of topics from Indo-Iranian languages to identity politics, political philosophy, Sufi poetry, and esoteric Islamic thought. And Chris Vogler, who's joining us tonight, and he joined us last week and has been with us for some wonderful salons. Some of you may remember our very first online salon was with Chris. Chris is the author of The Writer's Journey, former studio executive, story analyst, and speaker at writers' workshops and conferences all over the world. Thank you for being with us tonight, Chris. And we're also joined by a special guest. Some of you may remember him from a Myth Salon we had when we were in Dana's living room a couple years ago. Christophe Lemieux is trained as a quantum physicist and did his theoretical research in high energy physics for several years in France and Greece. He's also worked as a project manager at the National Center for Nuclear Energy in Paris, France, before moving to Los Angeles in 2007. He's currently the executive director of the C.G. Jung Institute of Los Angeles and the science editor of the Jungian journal, Psychological Perspectives. Thank you for being with us. Couldn't express my gratitude enough. And it's really cool because actually Christophe and Joe and I have had some conversations together separately around individuation, more specifically around synchronicity. So this is a really, really cool opportunity to be together with all of you. And Joe Cambray is the, and I'm going to pull up my wonderful go-to reference on mythhouse.org. Joe Cambray is the CEO and president of Pacifica. He's also the past president of the International Association for Analytical Psychology, which, for those of you who don't know, manages much of what the Jung Institutes and various Jung organizations do around the world. He served as the editor, the US editor for the Journal of Analytical Psychology, and is on the editorial boards of the Journal of Analytical Psychology, the Jung Journal, Culture and Psyche, and the Israel Annual of Psychoanalytic Theory, Research and Practice. He's been a faculty member at Harvard Medical School in the Department of Psychiatry at Massachusetts General Hospital, Center for Psychoanalytic Studies, adjunct faculty at Pacifica Graduate Institute. Dr. Cambray is a Jungian analyst, and his numerous publications include the book based on his lectures, Synchronicity, Nature and Psyche as an Interconnected Universe, and a volume edited with Linda Carter, Analytical Psychology, Contemporary Perspectives, and Jungian Psychology. So thank you for joining us today, Joe. I couldn't be more grateful and honored by your presence. Your bio goes on and on and on and on. So thank you. Really looking forward to where we go with synchronicity and where we go with individuation. And I know it'll be a really valuable topic for our audience of storytellers, mythologists, and depth psychologists. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Will. I really appreciate the opportunity to meet with all of you. It feels like a particularly charged moment in our culture and our history with this last year of the pandemic, and as that undergoes some changes. Well, it's not formally in this talk. We can spend some time, if people would like, to talk about the virus and the synchronistic phenomena around the novel coronavirus, because all viruses are basically psychoid in nature. That's where they fundamentally live. And so therefore, one expects these kinds of activations to occur at that level of the psyche. But before we go off on that, let me go ahead and start with sharing a PowerPoint that I have. So there we go. And what I'd like to cover briefly is the notion of synchronicity as an acausal connecting principle based on meaningful coincidences. This is the way Jung, of course, defined it. And that has to be seen in some way against the context of the kind of Enlightenment scientization of Western society. Other societies outside of Western Europe would have had other ways of describing these kind of phenomena. And now as we get into the 21st century, we actually need to reclaim some of that, because, well, synchronicity is an enormously valuable tool to helping us with, out of our cultural milieu, understand that. There are other understandings that are parallel to it that will enrich it. I'm going to touch on a few of those. But first, I want to start with the history. How did this concept develop? Where did it come from in Jung's thought? And what has been some of the development over the past 20 years or so? And particularly what for this group that's myth-focused and so oriented towards culture, I want to talk about cultural synchronicities, because that's something that doesn't get developed terribly much in the literature on this. I've written a tiny bit, the last chapter of my book has something, but I still think it's a topic that deserves a lot more research. So let's go to, where did this notion come from? Well, when I first wrote the book on synchronicity, I had bits and pieces, but the red book had not yet been published. So I didn't really have the chance to take the deep dive that if I were to do another edition of the book, I would now start there. Because it's very clear that in October of 1913, Jung and Freud sever their personal relationship and remain only professionally connected. And it's very distressing for both men. Both men go through a lot of psychological upheaval. Within a month, Jung is on a train going from Zurich to Schaffhausen to visit his relatives, and he has a waking dream. He's awake. He ends up in a reverie in which he sees Europe beginning to fill up with blood. And he's quite disturbed by this because as a well-trained psychiatrist working with schizophrenic patients, he recognizes the significance and meaning of this kind of upwelling of material from the psyche. And yet he does something really unexpected. Rather than sealing it off, as most would do at that point, he decides this is a place where he needs exploration. And of course, this is where he develops the techniques of active imagination, borrowing from his use of auto-hypnotic techniques he'd learned in Paris with Pierre Janet and some of the yoga that he's learned. And he begins to apply it to his own internal world, going into these affectively charged states, whether from dreams or from eruptions in his imagination. And really, he starts in late November, early December, and goes all the way until April, when they finally begin to settle down a bit. But this is the magma, the raw material of where his visionary experience of the Red Book comes from. And what we'll see is that's his point of entrance. By June, things are calming down. He's starting to feel like he's restabilizing, and he has the dreams of a frost coming, a deep, profound frost that causes leaves to curl up and form these very succulent grapes that have healing juices in them. But this is still frozen. And he's pondering this. He can feel that he has something to offer the masses, as it were. About 2 months later, August 1st, the guns of August. We have World War I break out. And now Jung finds himself on the horns of a tremendous dilemma. That is, has he had a prophetic set of visions? Remember, this happens twice for him, these sets of visions of Europe filling up with blood. And is he becoming a madman, or is he becoming a prophet? Neither of which is a resolution that he finds palatable or reasonable. And to deal with this, he takes his deep journey into the interior. This is his individuation journey. So where does that lead? I want to go to the Red Book now, the visuals from there, because I think they capture much of the essence of this. On your left, you'll see from very early on in the Red Book, it's from the first part, Liber Primus, right very near the beginning, he has a dream of the hero being attacked by a beetle and represents this in a vision that he's had. You see a setting sun being assaulted by a bunch of black snakes and this scarabide beetle chasing the blonde hero, which is certainly a representation of Jung and his scientism that I mentioned before. Now, just to keep a note here, the beetle is going to be extremely important because 20 years later, when he's writing up the case of the famous Synchronicity case, he is going to use the story of a woman who has a dream of a piece of golden jewelry that's in the shape of a scarab being given to her at a party. And at just that moment, there's a knocking on the window. Jung opens it, catches a scarab beetle that has flown in and says, "Here's your beetle." And that moment was a moment of lysis in the case. And that he said that the woman was somebody who was locked up, imprisoned by her own rationality. And this influx of the irrational, of the synchronistic, opened up the case and began to produce a real transformation for this woman. What he doesn't say there, and we didn't know until we saw some of these materials, is that his own countertransference must have been very powerful, because he knew that beetle. It had been part and parcel of his own experience. He certainly knew the image on the right and would have recognized that. This would be in the Night Sea journey, the journey that the sun undergoes in the Egyptian mythology of the dead. It goes into the underworld, the 12 steps of the underworld, 12 stages. And early on, the beetle god, beetle-headed god Khopri, holds the sun on the solar bark as it's carried through the underworld. Again, a lot of parallels. But you see the solar hero in that image again on the left. That's a very difficult place psychologically. You're in the drink. You're really swimming for your life. And it's an overwhelming feeling that's got to be with that. If you know the Red Book, you'll know the arc of the Red Book is chronological in terms of the pages. So when we get to page 55, we have this image. And here the relationship with the depths has now changed. This is a year or so later. You've got the Leviathan, the danger of the depth on one hand, but now that solar hero imaged in this golden egg sun figure is now on the bark, and it's part of the journey. Therefore, we have a sense of a psychological separation of ego and archetype here, and that we see this kind of moving in tandem. Now it's no longer being pursued. You notice that they're moving in accord. And that's a great psychological shift that you can see just in the imagery. This unfolds, and it's really wonderful to spend days and days going through the imagery and watching the transformations. But for purposes of time, I want to move to the denouement of our narrative. And that is, how does Jung get out of that dilemma? Well, as he tells it, the famous image that happens is here. In 1928, you can see that if you go to page 163 of the Red Book and you read there, it's in German, but you can read, he's basically saying, in 1928, I received from my friend Richard Wilhelm a copy of an ancient Taoist manuscript called The Secret of the Golden Flower. I was asked to do a foreword and a commentary, and this was a transformative moment because, as Jung describes it, he was in the middle of working on this mandala, the one you see there on page 163, and he was very struck by the quality of his mandala and the frontispiece of the Golden Flower manuscript, which was this image of the Vajra mandala here. Jung said that the colors match. Now, that's an interesting question. I've not been able to find the actual original. I've talked to the Wilhelm's granddaughter and so forth, and she only has the black and white version as well. It's a little bit of a mystery, but apparently the greenish yellow struck Jung as somehow, even within his own fantasy before he received this as part of this. Now, that laced open the question of what he was doing with the Red Book. And he goes on to say he was able to then set down the Red Book activity and return to the world in the world of science. Well, what does that mean? Well, the same year in 1928, when you read the dream analysis seminars, you'll see that in November of 28, Jung's conducting a seminar on dreams in which they are looking at a patient of his, some dream imagery, and it ends up with the image of a ball, and Jung does a long amplification on this, and the patient spontaneously, who doesn't know about the seminar, produces the image within a week of the solar disk between the horns of a bull. And it is matched by numerous people in the seminar, all having some kind of connection to bull imagery. I mean, it was really stunning to the point where they stopped the seminar and people were saying, Dr. Jung, what's going on? What's happening here? And what Jung said to the group, he said, well, look, in the West, we have a predilection for cause and effect. That's the way we understand. That's our cosmology. But in the East, there's more what we would call kairos, a coming together in time, the quality of the moment. And that's what we're looking at here, that all of these things are coming together synchronously. And the editors of the dream analysis seminar say this is the very first use of the term that leads to synchronicity. This is in a private seminar. He doesn't use it publicly for a couple of years until 1930. But you can now understand what Jung is saying, that in 28 with this seminar, he receives this Secret of the Golden Flower. It's coming together, and his solution that transcends madness or prophecy is synchronicity. That is, it is something fundamental to the nature of the universe. It is not a personal acquisition. Yes, the psyche of a person can open up to this, they can be receptive to it, and things will happen, although you don't cause it. It's a being in touch and being resonant with the moment, but it's about patterns of the universe coming together, and that's what he's picking up on. Now, what he doesn't say here, and you'll have to pull the strands together, if you go back a year from this, and now we have a little clearer evidence in the Black books, it was in January the 2nd of 1927, more than a year before this happened, he had the very famous Liverpool Dream. This is a dream in which Jung is he's imagining himself in the city of Liverpool, and it's sooty and rainy and dark and cold, and he's with another group of Swiss, and they're walking through, and they come to the Alley of the Dead and the Peter's Church and so forth. And Jung then has a vision there of an island with a magnolia tree on it in full bloom that's in the sun. It's the only sunny place. And it's said that there's a Swiss who lives in Liverpool, and Jung, even in the dream as he's waking up, he understands in a deep way the meaning of that dream being it's this central experience of the self, the achievement of the self that he is witnessing in that dream of a magnolia tree on the island that's so key. And he says this was the culminating dream that gave him the notion of individuation. Now, the golden flower comes a year later, but you see the resonance. That golden flower of the magnolia tree, the mulan tree or yulan tree in Chinese, which has some very interesting healing properties, by the way. That's a whole nother piece. But basically, Jung's vision is a premonition of exactly this, which happens a year later. It's a kind of a fulfillment where the golden flower actually comes in the form of a manuscript that points him towards alchemy. And this is where Jung goes from here. He now exits the Red Book by and large over the next couple of years, and really begins to pursue the historical study of alchemy, where he is finding historical evidence to demonstrate the individuation process that he has found through his own work, and becomes affirmed in these cultural examples, whether from the East or from the West. Just before we leave this piece of synchronicity, I want you to see where Jung took this, because this is still very early days for Jung in 28. And even when he mentions it at Wilhelm's memorial service, it's not a tremendously well-articulated idea. It really doesn't get fully seated until he begins his dialogue with Wolfgang Pauli. And that happens in 1932 when Pauli's referred to him for treatment. And after a bit of things that happen with another therapist and so forth, Jung actually forms an ongoing relationship and correspondence, out of which emerges the Synchronicity essay in the late 40s and early 50s. And as a part of that essay, there's a famous statement in there. Jung says, "Since experience has shown that under certain conditions, space and time can be reduced to almost zero, causality disappears along with them, because causality is bound up with the existence of space and time and physical changes, and consists essentially in the succession of cause and effect. For this reason, synchronistic phenomena cannot in principle be associated with any conception of causality." Well, when you look at that and you look at the date, I mean, this was first articulated in 1948 in his Eranos lecture, where he's first capturing this. This is within a year or two of Fred Hoyle's articulating the Big Bang Theory, where space and time have, this is the origin point. It's our scientific myth of origin. It's our creation myth. And in that, at the very first instance of creation, there are no laws of physics. When you go where space and time collapse to almost zero, if you run the thing backwards in a way, you end up in a place before gravity, before electromagnetism, before the weak or strong nuclear forces have yet come into existence. And what he's saying is, in that place, starting there is a pattern formation. And modern cosmologists would be fine with this, to be honest. This is the wrinkles in space and time that create reality in a way. But that patterning is not a causal patterning. It's a fundamental shape of our universe. And this is the cosmology Jung is inviting us into in a very deep way to embrace. And it transcends the Enlightenment scientism of his day and what we had been in since the middle of the 17th century. We're still yet to claim this. Where I want to go tonight with it is also to show that it has some decolonial components to it. That Jung didn't articulate these, but I think it's hidden in this, because when we go back to this origin point, you no longer have the separations of subject and object. That's a later phenomena. So this is a place before subjectivity and objectivity have been split apart. That's crucial, because that's the kind of porosity that makes the link that really is key to this whole notion of synchronicity. So when I first was approaching this, it wasn't as a theoretician, it was as a clinician. I had several cases of people who had very severe trauma histories, and there were a number of synchronistic experiences that got activated in the treatments. I've told the famous case, for me, of the Black Forest. This was a patient I had who had a very severe trauma history, and as a part of an unusual aspect of the treatment, we agreed to one phone call when I was away out of the area. And in that call, she immediately was very anxious and said, where are you? Are you in Germany? And I said, no, I'm not in Germany. Well, why are you asking? And she said, well, I dreamed you were in the Black Forest and I couldn't find you, and I was terrified. And so we worked to help stabilize her, and it actually was quite successful. But I was in the Caribbean, and the next day I was going diving, and the site, my very first dive in open water, was to a site called the Black Forest. I didn't know that until we got near to the site. The dive master said, oh, by the way, today's dive is called the Black Forest because it's black coral. And it was an exquisite dive. And when I came up out of it, after I got over my anxiety and did the dive, I realized that we were in an image that held us both. Very different vertices in that image. We were in the image of a black forest, and that forest for her was reminiscent of Grimm's fairy tales and witches and monsters that would eat you up. Mine was a transcendent experience to another world, and yet they were both black forests. And I'll show you a little bit more of my work more recently with rhizomes, and I'm back in the forest again, unbeknownst to me when I first started to do that. That's the way these archetypal patterns unfold. But that led me, working with that patient, led me to some research that was done at the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico. And what that was a group of Nobel laureates who got together and said, each of us are really skilled in our own discipline, but the most interesting questions at this point in history are not what I know about physics or what you know about mathematics or you know about chemistry or you in economics, but what lies in between. It's the interactive field, and this is transdisciplinary. It starts with some interdisciplinary, but it's ultimately transdisciplinary at a very deep root. And Susan Rowland has been a champion of this here at Pacifica, and I have much respect for that perspective, because it really links with where I'm going here. What they began to look at were how do you understand the complexity of systems in the world? And one of the things their research taught them very quickly was that many of the more complex phenomena come out of the interactions between things, whether those are molecules or people or galaxies. And when the interactions are under competitive conditions, you get what's called emergent forms that transcend. There was where the sum of what's going on is greater than the parts. So a very simple example, a glass of water. One of the questions you could ask is, why is it liquid at room temperature? As a quantum physicist, you would look at water as single molecule water, and that wouldn't be obvious. You'd look at the weight of hydrogen sulfide, just where you place sulfur by the oxygen by sulfur, and it's a gas at room temperature. So what is it about water? Well, it's not inherent in the molecule itself, it's the interactions between them. These interactions here produce that liquidity. That's an emergent property. Let's look at some other things from nature. There's lots and lots of emergent forms. Here is a form of an ant bridge. You can see the ants are crossing from one rock to the other. They use their bodies to construct a bridge. Now, there's no internal image of a bridge inside of an ant. It's emergent in the environment. It's the way in which organisms interact with their environments, and they create things, sometimes temporarily, sometimes more permanently. And that form, that's the emergent form, is what is the complex experience. Now, if you think about synchronicity, that my patient and myself, we both have an experience that we both contribute to something. And that third, that bridge in this case, or that black forest in our case, that synchronistic form that holds us both is a complex form. It's the emergent property of our interactions. So that same principle goes throughout nature. Give you a couple of more examples. The human microbiome. We all have this, a human being is shockingly only has about 25,000 genes. When the Human Genome Project was begun in the late 90s and into the early 2000s, we thought that there would be about 200,000. We thought it'd be about 10 times more genetic material than in fact we have. There are lots of reasons for that, how we develop our complexity, but one of the things that quickly came of this was to study all of the organisms on and in us. That is the fungi and the bacteria and the viruses. We form an ecology. And when you take that ecology, it only accounts for maybe 5–10% of your weight if you took all that substance in and on us, that living substance. But in terms of genetic material, it's about 2 to 3 million genes. In other words, 100-fold more genetic material is there. And that does shape us. In other words, what I'm getting at is we're going to decenter, delocalize who we are. And the psyche is a further extension of that. That we ourselves are not completely local, and we're in a distributed network, and our psyche is much more so. It really is an interactive field. And the synchronistic experiences are in these kinds of fields. They are not within just simple, condensed intra-psychic events. So one more example from nature. Here's starlings. As they go to protect themselves at night before they roost, they often go through these elaborate dances and produce really these remarkable forms. Anybody who's interested, put in murmuration, which is the name for these patterns, and do it. Just put it into YouTube, and you will get some of the most remarkable images of the way these patterns of starling murmurations occur, often set to music of various sorts. Classical music seems to be one that people like. It carries an enormous resonance with these things. But it's the way nature seems to act in wholes rather than simply as individuals, and the way individuals create something more than. By the way, this murmuration is very effective in protecting the individuals. This is actually an evolutionary adaptive strategy, because there are lots of images. It's like peregrine falcons, which will hunt starlings, will go after this, and they cannot focus on an individual. This movement overwhelms their capacity to hone in on the individual. And you'll see them fly off in frustration because they can't get a meal out of this. This is aesthetics and self-protection simultaneously. So I love that the idea that biology is and our impulses are not simply just the Darwinian survival, but there's an aesthetic dimension to them as well, the way they are expressed. I think that's extremely important. Okay, that's just a quick tour. Now, what if we were to take some of these ideas and think about them in terms of culture? So I'm going to take one example from my book and an example or two beyond my book. In the book, what I talk about, I give 3-4 examples of cultural synchronicities, that is like the origins of democracy. And the second one is about the encounter of the Spanish with the native peoples of the Americas. In particular, I'll look at Cortez and Moctezuma, between a 16th century Spaniard and 16th century Aztec. And what's remarkable about that are the synchronicities that Cortez had no idea of himself. He manipulated and used them in a very powerful way. And this is a kind of a mythic narrative, because we're going to look at archetypal activation. The story starts with the Aztecs having their sovereignty, their sense of rulership and power in the country of Mexico, especially in their capital of Tenochtitlan, through Quetzalcoatl. That's the kind of Toltec ancestry that they use. And in part of the stories about Quetzalcoatl, there's the story of Tolpitz and Quetzalcoatl, and there's some complexity about several different historical figures here. But here's the plumed serpent. Here it is in the shape of a man, and you'll see that he's bearded. And part of the narrative that's really striking about this Quetzalcoatl is that he sails off. He's been tricked by a sorcerer, and he vows to return to Mexico in the future. And he sails off at what would be today the site of Veracruz, and either is immolated or he ascends into the sky. He is said to return, but no one knows when. And the year that he returns, there's an astrological set of predictions from the Aztec and Mayan calendars that say the year that he returns will be very important. Well, the year in question for us is 1519, and that year was the year of reeds, one reeds in the Aztec calendar, and it meant that when Quetzalcoatl returned, it would be at the level of an assault on the ruler, on the king. The kind of arrows that he had would be the ones that would be aimed at the ruler. So here's some examples, just to give you a little bit of sort of a feeling for the imagery of Quetzalcoatl as a bearded figure. And this is unusual because in Mesoamerica, this kind of facial hair is not, in the indigenous people, was not this strong. But it was very marked in the figure of the Mayan figure of Kukulkan or Quetzalcoatl have this kind of bearded plumed serpent. And so when you see Cortez, you see how he fits the fantasy. And where does he land? He lands on Good Friday of 1519 at the site of Veracruz. He returns exactly where the myth says. Now, he doesn't know this at first. He finds this out through his various people who have served as interpreters and so forth to him. And there are then a series of 10 major coincidences in Aztec cosmology that get linked to what's happening. They're very closely linked. There's a book called Irony and Empire by David Carrasco, who details these at some length. I've got a reference to it in the book. But you can see how Cortez manifests this. And in the encounter, here we have the figure of La Malinche, or Dona Marina. This is a woman who was enslaved in the Mayan world, or in the Yucatan, where he picked her up first before he came to the mainland. And she's extremely intelligent, and she picks up enough Spanish to actually be able to interpret between the indigenous languages of various societies in Mexico and Spanish. And here she is helping Cortez, for which she's vilified. And she's also the mother of the country in some other ways. A very, very interesting figure. But the coincidences are used in a destructive way. And this is one of the warnings I would have about synchronicity. It doesn't come with a moral valence. We know that it is very powerful. It has a very intense quality to it, and it can be enormously helpful, but it can be destructive. It depends on how you use it. I wanted to just read to you a bit about some reports at the time with all of these coincidences, sort of just prior to this meeting that I've got on the screen here. The cumulative effect was to create consternation, confusion, and doubt in the Aztecs, all of these coincidences, but especially in Moctezuma's mind. According to reports gathered from native witnesses, the apparent return of Quetzalcoatl left Moctezuma, in quote, terror-struck. He was filled with great dread, swooning. His soul was sickened, his heart was anguished. It is reported that he remarked, "What will now befall us? In great torment is my heart, as if washed in chilly water." And the Carrasco goes on to note his chilly water heart has taken on the character of what Rudolf Otto would call a creature feeling of numinous dread, awe, and urgency. He is encountering his numen, the origins of his rulership, and it is an uncanny experience. It is synchronistic. It's that sense of the synchronicity there. So it opens things up. But here again, and perhaps it's inevitable in some way, that the conquest of Mexico would not go well when a synchronicity is misused. But we now can come back and begin to think about what are the meanings of these synchronicities and these encounters, and how else, if this had been a more empathic exchange, what that might have looked like. How these kinds of things could have been handled in a different way, and what richness might not have been lost. So be it. I mean, that's the kind of brief narrative. Let's take a second narrative that goes back a century or two before, and that's to the figure of Timur. He's in the line of Genghis Khan, who's the 13th, 14th century conqueror, and he's another. Timur is also known as Tamerlane or Timur the Lame, because he'd had a hip injury in his youth. But he was a remarkably complex figure in terms of the development of the Silk Road and the communication of multiple cultures, the kind of internet of the medieval world in a way. And he was both a terrible scourge, and millions of people died at his hands and his troops, and yet brought great culture simultaneously. And so you have this sense of a very, very complex figure that's there. Here's his tomb in Samarkand in Uzbekistan. He was on his way to try to invade the Ming dynasty in China when he fell ill with a flu and died that winter. But on his own wishes, he put a curse on his own tomb. And what he said, there were two engravings in there. The first one says, "When I rise from the dead, the world shall tremble." And the second, inside the tomb, says, "Whoever disturbs my tomb will unleash an invader more terrible than I." And the synchronicity comes hundreds of years later, and these synchronicities play out. When you have cultural synchronicities, they don't just play out over the course of a year or two in someone's life. They play out over the centuries. And that tomb was disturbed in June of 1941. There were Russian archaeologists sent there by Stalin, who was interested in this whole story of Timur. He saw him as a kind of prelude to himself. And he had the body just interred. He violated the tomb. 2 days later, Operation Barbarossa was launched by the Nazis. They invaded Russia. And it almost was a complete catastrophe. There were close to 20 million Russians died, oddly similar to the number of people that Timur had killed over the course of his life. But what happened is, and I don't know how apocryphal this is, except the events happened. Some people say that Stalin began to take the curse seriously as the 1941 and 42 unfolded. And finally, had the body reinterred with full Islamic rites into the tomb. A month later, Stalingrad fell. And that was, of course, the major turning point of the Second World War and the defeat of the Nazis. So it's been a fascinating story. There's enough documentation, historical documentation, that this set of coincidences happened. What exactly it means, is this genuine prophecy? How do we understand that? I think is interesting for us to discuss in terms, because obviously Stalin knew something about the curse and he was playing with it in a way, but I think it came alive. It activated, the psyche activated in a way that was totally unexpected. I'm going to just say a few words about this, and then we'll wrap up in just a couple of minutes. So I told you about the Black Forest and rhizomes, and this is a part of that general interest. I've been for years interested in biological intelligence. You might think about it from Jung and alchemical perspectives as the lumen naturae, the light in nature, in the dark, hidden in the dark of nature, that there's intelligence there, there's mind in there, and it isn't cranial, and it isn't the kind of neural systems that we generally privilege for ourselves. But what this is here, this was some engineers, this was a scientific piece of research. What you're looking at are these little pieces here are oat bran flakes. And they're put there at the rail stations in Tokyo. This is a map of the city of Tokyo. Here's Tokyo Bay out here, and the city's here. Here are all the rail stops. And some slime mold is introduced at the center of this, and just allowed to grow for 26 hours. Well, in its seeking out food, it creates a network. And here's the picture there's a schemata of the network. And here's what it took engineers about 15, 20 years to figure out what that rail network should look like. The point of the engineers were saying, if we learn how to ask nature the right questions, if we engage nature, it will give us a very good starting place. It has some intelligence to bring back to us. And now people have gone on to make these kind of observations about there's a kind of, and they link it to psychology and so forth. I won't read through all of this for time purposes, but you can see that there's a kind of computational intelligence that's implicitly in there. It's not they sit down with pencil and paper and work out equations, but the way in which they engage the world shows that kind of intelligence. And that functions in all kinds of ways to create these kinds of networks, the intelligence in nature. For example, trees that are interconnected to one another to form giant interconnected rhizomal networks. Peter Wohleben's Hidden Life of Books, which really comes off the research of Suzanne Simard up in British Columbia, shows the way these networks really function and create these structures. I think they're very important for us. Jung used rhizomes. He used the notion of the rhizome to explain the psyche. He said, the individual is like the flower that comes up, the perennial flower that comes up and blooms and for one season and then it's gone, but the rhizome persists underneath, and that's the collective psyche. And so I want to ask you what you might think this is. Usually we have two guesses, and they're close and they're linked. And you can see the rhizomal structure here, just the kind of like bamboo and everything else has this fundamental form. Well, 3 days after that, somebody published this comparison. On your left is a slice through a mouse brain showing the neural network, mammalian brain neural network. On your right is the cosmic web. That is the shape of the universe at its largest scale. What we have are clusters of galaxies held by dark matter and long filaments, and with the spaces in between of darkness caused by dark energy separating them. And so the rhizomal structure of the mind of the universe bear close parallel. And just this year, some NASA scientists took that slime mold research and they said, let's do an algorithm on that. So they developed an algorithm about the way the slime mold grows, and they applied it to this picture here, to the cosmic web, and found that it was a very useful starting place to begin to understand the dynamics of how that cosmic web formed. So you see, we're getting to a place where our centrality, the Anthropocene mess that we've made of our world, is coming back for another kind of deeper look. And I think this is where, and if I had time, but I don't think I should go on much longer, I think I'll wrap it up here. But the other part of the talk would be to go into the oracular traditions, the altered states of consciousness, and to look at figures. I'll just go get to the picture. The Pythia Delphi, and there's now new evidence of what was the altered states that she was entering into and their noetic quality. And I think this is, for as depth psychologists, this is one of the pleas I would have, that we begin to really explore altered states of consciousness for their noetic potentials. They may not tell us everything, but they certainly can tell us a lot, and they'll tell us a lot about the nature of reality in the world. So with that, I think I will bring this portion to a close and return us back to the world of our panel and our conversation for the evening. So thank you all for your attention.
Well, while Will is doing that, Joe, I just really want to thank you for a brilliant presentation. That was absolutely fabulous. I'm intrigued by the whole notion of the delocalizing and the breakup between the subject and object. It sounds to me like we're talking about the participation mystique. And I'm wondering whether synchronicity is a more inhabited state of being for people who are in a condition of participation mystique. We may think of it as exceptional, but perhaps when we are bound up in a state of consciousness where we have oneness, what we really have is a condition of synchronicity that is normalized.
Yeah, one of the things that I've done some research on is the way Jung presents the synchronicity hypothesis. It's qualitative, that is, you're just sort of on or off. But he actually had some queries back and forth, C.A. Meyer being one of the people who said, I think the mind-body relationship is synchronistic. And Jung said, well, if you're right, and I think you might be, then I've got to rethink this, that there may be a level at which this is ordinary, this is part of our everyday world. And I think that there are a whole range of synchronicities. The intensity is probably linked with affect. So something like the scarab beetle or the black forest, they're pretty charged affectively in terms of our experience. But I think there are other things that, having a reverie, you're thinking suddenly about a friend, and the next thing you know, they call you on the phone. What do you know? Common experience we've all had. I think there are many, many of these. And I would actually say that you could think about a Richter scale of synchronicities, that there are some rare, very high intensity ones where there's a huge amount of affect going on in that kind of transformation. But there are other ones that are part of our everyday life. And we haven't had the psychological tools to recognize that and open this up. I'm particularly interested with, there's an anthropologist at Stanford, Tanya Luhrmann. Some of you may know her work. And her most recent book is, How God Becomes Real. That's the title of the book. And she's looking at the kind of psychological construction that has to go on. And just this year, she's published a couple of papers that are looking at two things that are fundamental. One is porosity, and the other is absorption. Porosity of our models of the mind. And our model is really unporous, the ones we've had. Synchronicity, as you're pointing to, this is where I'm coming, Dana, around to your point, is that synchronicity takes that kind of rigid Cartesian separation of subject and object and says it's actually a much more porous situation. And deep states of meditation that produce something like a cosmic web seem to me to be good examples of just exactly that kind of phenomena, that there's much more porosity than our models will give us the ability to use. But if we can begin as depth psychologists to reclaim that and then allow ourselves, like the Pythia is going to be something where you allow yourself in and get absorbed by that porosity, that there's something much more powerful about a window into the nature of reality that's possible there. And so I think we need to map this out in a way. Some of it's already begun. I mean, the stuff with the LSD research and so forth was some first tries at beginning to find these. But I think if you look at shamanic traditions around the globe, you'll find that these people were real psychonauts. They really did explore a very broad range of states of consciousness and saw what you could get out of each of the different states. Our psychology is not there yet, but it's something I think holds a future for us.
Joe, it just opened up so many corridors for me, and I'm sure for many others. One of the moments of synchronicity happened in the classroom, and I know I'm not alone, where on a break, having been reading the Odyssey together, a student will come up on the break and say, you know, this epic is exactly what I needed right now in my life, because every action that is taking place with Odysseus, I feel connected to. So that's one form. But the larger thing that I want to bring up and then ask a question of you, one of the things that I enjoyed for decades teaching was the long class days, essentially 7 hours. And about 3 years ago, 3 years before I went part-time, I really got interested in what kind of energy field is being constructed in the classroom around one or another of these literary epics. And so I started to time it over about 2 years, each quarter. And I didn't say anything to the students because I didn't want them to be informed and then be shaped by it. But I discovered that it was uniformly 1 hour and 15 minutes, about the time that, you know, we'd be ready to take a break. And what I noticed is that when the field, and having the field in place didn't mean that we all agreed with one another, but there was a sense of a consensus. The collective thinking deepened. The level of the conversation deepened. And I just found this absolutely marvelous, and it was fragile. It could easily be interrupted or disrupted. But when everyone had bought into the experience, the mimetic experience that the poet was offering us, yeah, deepening is the best word that I can use. So this isn't seamless because I'm thinking this through. I took a few notes, but here's what I want to ask you. Is synchronicity, no, let me reverse it. Is analogy forming a form of synchronicity? And it's not that I'm setting up something cause and effect. It bypasses that. So that, here's how I wrote it to myself as I listened to you. This complex relationship between what I'm reading, hearing, and what relationship is forming in the field of that reading. Is that synchronicity? In other words, is analogy a form that synchronicity takes, to your thinking?
Yeah, let me try to approach it from a couple of different directions.
Okay.
What you're talking about is something I'll slide the metaphor over to the clinical experience, but I think it's very parallel. Because I found myself wondering why I had a thought about this kind of image with this patient at this moment. And it's often when something deepens, when there's a kind of affective engagement, there's an empathic link and
Yeah.
an image is coming into being. And it caused me to go back and look at what was Jung talking about with amplification? Why was that a meaningful technique? It's analogy formation. I mean, it's the same thing.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
you're sitting there with a patient and you're working on something, and suddenly an image starts to form in the mind, and associations begin to build, and you begin to recognize a kind of cultural analogy or a mythic analogy that often came to mind. And so that question of what's that doing, I began to look back at how Jung used it. And it seemed to me he had the intuition that something, a third was forming in the interaction, which is a kind of complex interaction of all the parts creating something, a third that's greater than any one of the individuals. That's the emergent form. And to glimpse that form, you use analogies to capture like a die. You know, in other words, I'll use a biological example. If I am a novice and I'm studying one-celled creatures, it's very hard to see anything. You don't get any sense of the definition or form of the different parts unless you put a dye on them. You know, some kind of stain that brings out, heightens features. And then suddenly you start to be able to see into them with greater and greater clarity, and you begin to notice all the different parts. There's a kind of enhanced differentiation. Well, I think that's exactly what amplification does. And it's not about using an intellectual analogy to somehow cognitively master this. It's really capturing what's coming into being in the room in the moment.
Yeah,
and
beautiful.
I think that's what you're doing with your teaching.
Yes, and you know, and I'll just share this with all of you, but and you don't have to respond to this, but it feels right to express it. And in the volume 9.2, the Ion volume, and I memorized this because it made such an impact on me when I read it many years ago. And I can even tell you all the paragraph is 414. And Jung says this in a dependent adverbial clause, which I thought when I read it is the heartbeat of depth psychology. And here's what he says. Since analogy formation is a law which to a large extent governs the psyche, comma, and then he has an independent clause that we don't need because it's alluding to something in paragraph 413. When I read that the ability of the psyche to create analogies is a law of the psyche, I thought, well, that captures a great deal for me about what depth psychology is contributing to the world in a very transdisciplinary, I'll use Susan's word, way.
The only thing I would add to that is the time dimension of it. You know, why this moment? You know, that analogy coming into being. There's a time, there's a kairos to that. And I think that's part of the synchronistic field to these things.
Yes.
There's an appropriateness.
An appropriateness, yeah. Beautiful, Joe. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks, Dennis.
Can I jump in here?
Please.
Chris talking. This has just been delicious. I mean, this is like a huge Thanksgiving meal, you know, with many, many courses and something that we're all going to be enjoying for quite some time. Just off of what was just said by Dennis, one thing I've noticed is that synchronicities seem to follow kind of the same rules as dreams. Especially a very vivid dream. It's something that it's vivid because it's uncanny. There's something about it that's not natural or not, let's say, materialistic. It's not from the world of cause and effect. And in order to make use in your psychological development of a dream or of a synchronicity, it really is for you to meditate upon. It's an object of meditation. And that's how I'm processing the significant synchronicities, I think, in my own life, is that something, perhaps inside me, perhaps external, that's another question. But something is trying to tell me something. And it's for me, as Jung did in great depth, explored his own journey with that. But there is a story-making aspect to synchronicity. That's what you do. You make a story out of it. And I also would bounce off of something you said, Joe, about, and I didn't know this, about Jung predicting, or his dreams and meditations and visions, predicting the horrors of war. This is something I've observed in the movie business, that movies are predictive, and that, it was very obvious before World War II. If you look back at the movies from 1939, 36 through 39, they know that war is coming, and they know a lot about it. And it's expressed in many ways in The Adventures of Robin Hood and Warner Brothers gangster movies. The metaphors are all pointing towards what's coming down the pike. So those are a couple of thoughts. And also just that this is all slippery and difficult to deal with, because we're stuck with words. And the words are placeholders, some people have said, for a mystery. And I think that was where Joseph Campbell came in on things like this. It's a mystery beyond human comprehension. And we need the stories and the metaphors, and we need the stories we make out of the synchronicities in order to, stumble towards some kind of meaning. So where do you think these things come from? That's my pointed question out of this. Is it generated by the universe to guide us towards some greater level of understanding, or is this something we impose on it ourselves?
Yeah, that's a question that people have struggled with, and I don't know that I have an answer. My own experience leans in the direction of the first. That is, that there does seem something. There's a deep telos in these things, that they add up. If you study dreams, not just individual dreams, but you get a dream series, you begin to see a lexicon evolving for a person. And as that person engages with it, that deepens and it brings more meaning. It isn't that they figure out a meaning, it's the meaning emerges out of the interactions with these things. So I think, these altered states that we're talking about that people can enter into, where time is not so linear, and therefore the predictive piece, it's predictive for a kind of linear ego consciousness. I think in other kinds of cultures, these kind of altered states are known to have these kind of values. And the whole question of how much of our construction of time is an illusion, it's a cultural construction in a subtle kind of way that we are so dependent on that it's extremely difficult to extricate ourselves from. Whereas these levels of experience may be simultaneously all present at the same time. And a lot of the new work on quantum mechanics that I know about decoherence theory and so forth, are saying that you don't just collapse the wave function. This was the old Copenhagen model. It's a particle or a wave while you're running through a slit, and then it becomes one or the other. One slit, two slits, and you get these kind of things. But more and more, there's been work and research to suggest that even if you have it start to manifest in one direction, the other states remain virtually there. And there's something about that virtual set of possibilities that we've not explored before, and they contain this level of information and access. So I think that's where, if this is fundamentally part of the structure of the universe, and when I saw that's cosmic web, it's just very hard for me to resist the temptation to say, this is so archetypal, this rhizomatic form, that it's something we need to be better in touch with. Not that we figure it out, but it's it's the way the universe itself manifests. And are we part of that manifestation? Are we fighting it? So.
Yeah, I think here of Terence McKenna, who sort of tongue-in-cheek created a whole complex order of levels of where this stuff is coming from that he called the Cosmic Coincidence Control Center, and said there were, higher and lower versions of that. And we had some bureau that was in charge over the earth of laying out these things. And I think he wasn't entirely serious about this, but it does point to our need to understand. We want to put names to things. We want to, impose our materialistic schemes on things, and that may be ultimately beside the point. And really, it doesn't matter. If you get something out of it, just as with dreams and watching movies, then you're ahead of the game.
There's a psychological experience. The other thing I would say that is in tandem with that, this whole question, synchronicity really does erode the notion of objectivity, in the sense that there's an outside objective truth, and that's of higher value and prominence over subjective experiences. As you begin, synchronicity links the two of those together and flattens that field, the whole question of authority begins to show, because that objective authority that is right and correct no longer holds that centrality. I think it's a real challenge to really deconstruct and decolonialize the way our models of the psyche have been. And you're really touching on them in a very nice way, I think.
Thank you, Joe, for such a wonderful lecture. It reminds me of the lecture you gave a few years ago at the Institute, and it was like for 4 hours. And I know that probably you have material for 10 hours or more, and I would still be very impressed by what you're saying. Jung was saying that really insects are really closer to the formal principles of nature. And so for us, it's something that is very difficult to understand. But yeah, you showed these images of the ants. I remember that you showed some other images of wasps getting through the, and it was really very impressive to see that. I was always wondering what is in the, I don't know if you can say that, what is in the mind of these insects when they do that? And I don't know if we're going to have the answer, the response to this question at some point, but it's always striking me. I don't think that we will understand anything about synchronicity if we before we understand how these insects think, and so we're probably very far away from this. Well, as a quantum physicist, for me, there's always things that question me. For example, when we talk about complexity, I know that it brings something which is the fact that the whole is more than the parts. But at the same time, I always feel that in complexity, space is still space and time is still time. And so it's still a kind of emergence. It's a kind of causality which is at work. There's always a code there. There's kind of algorithm. It's a phase transition. There's all kind of things happening. And so it's not quite the way I understand Jung's way of looking at synchronicity. I know that we can extend that notion, but the way Jung was pointing at synchronicity was the fact that time and space didn't exist at all, in a way. There was something, there was a nothing, if I can say that. And suddenly there was something happening. And so it's been always something which for me is very profound. There is a principle in nature which makes things happen, and it's not causal, it's not emergent, it's just happening. Something is happening from nothing, and I don't know if it happens outside. Most likely, it might happen in living creatures like us, Maybe it happens with ants. Maybe it happens with other insects. I don't know what creates reality. I think there's a kind of Copernican shift that that we might want to consider, which is the fact that reality out there doesn't exist. We as human beings make that happen, and it's a kind of different narrative, which is for me very fascinating to see that life is not emergent; it's there. And I don't know how it came there, but suddenly, because we interact with each other, reality happens. And so I was just wondering if you had anything to say in that line, and or maybe I'm just completely delusional.
And I've been waiting to hear each other's responses to this particular question of emergence for like 5 years. So
No, it's a very good point he's making, and I want to be very clear here. Emergence is not the end of the story. It's a way to get deeper into the story, but it's not the end. I wouldn't want to stop there. From the very beginning, I've said, look, this will get us a chunk of the way further in the story. We can begin to see other things. It gives us a set of tools to see a bit more, but it's not the end of the narrative of whatever synchronicity is. Because again, as you point out, Jung's cosmology is that pre-Big Bang kind of state. He's going back into something that we cannot grasp through things that are already manifest and separated out. There's something more in that unus mundus kind of quality there that's operative. So I think there are some mysteries there that you describe a lot of synchronistic phenomena with complexity theory. I think it's useful there to talk about phenomena, but that's not the same as the experience in itself at its core, where it fundamentally comes from. The thing about insects, you're absolutely correct. I mean, when I first got on this, one of the things I realized, you read Freud on telepathy, and that's one of the first things he talks about. Because Freud was absolutely captured by telepathy. He was a very firm believer in telepathy. He thought his daughter Anna was particularly gifted. She probably was. And he tries to do a causal reductive move. He says, well, in evolutionary history, these are earlier forms of communication, and they're not as effective as language. So, psychoanalysis tends to lean towards the linguistic expression. But he was saying that there was something about the kind, especially in the social insects, the way in which the interactions create a distributed, non-local kind of network that has its own intelligence. And I think that's certainly something that I'm seeing more and more in terms of complexity of intelligence. Nature has two solutions. One is to put a bunch of neurons inside of a closed box, like a cranium, and another one is to have a bunch of interactions going on between linked individuals, and that creates another kind of intelligence. And the example you were talking about the beetle larvae who go on that mythic journey, they're picked up by the bee and then they're carried back to the hive where they eat the pollen, and that's part of their transformation. It's these mythic narratives that are fundamentally there in nature. We put language on them, but in fact, there's a lived quality that's fundamental to the way nature just is. It isn't even about trying to express itself. And the complexity stuff comes out of a lot of research about the failure of a Darwinian explanation to talk about the origins of life. Complexity tries to get at that question. I don't think it's really going to get there, but I think it is heading in that. It's part of its arc. So, and insects, one last thought about that comes to mind. In the last year or so, there have been all of these scientific hypotheses that insects have feelings, primitive feelings. They're more and more capacity to register. There's something affectively going on. So not only are you afraid of a spider, but it can be afraid of you. That there's a whole other level of animation to the world. And I think that's part of our models, are the mechanization of the world and the reclaiming of what life is, that it's not a very sophisticated mechanism. But there's something fundamentally wrong with that. I think that's what you're getting at.
Yeah. Well, I heard a story just maybe 2 weeks ago about bees. Someone was talking about bees, and he was actually talking from his office, and he was saying that at some point at his university, he decided to put a hive next to his office, and he was a little bit scared of that. Because well, you don't want to have too many bees around you. And so one day, what happened is there was a bee in his office, and it was a bee that was walking. It was not flying. And so he knew that it was a sign that the bee was a little bit tired. That happens. And so he knew, he was in contact with a beekeeper. So he knew that if you give some honey from the hive to the bee, then it can really get some energy. And and so this is what he did. He gave, I don't know where he got the honey, but he gave some honey to the bee. The bee just ate the honey, or I don't know, drank the honey, and then it started to fly away. And then from this day on, he had no problem at all with the hive next to his office. There was the word was transmitted that basically, well, this guy is good. Just leave him. And so there's a kind of intelligence here. It's really
absolutely. Just a very quick response. The pandemic has opened a lot of this up for people. I've certainly noticed it myself. I have a backyard that has a lot of birds, and I do things to get birds to come in there, certainly plants and so forth. And I always have been seeing the birds as, I would always try to be very cautious and careful and not scare them away. And I started watching during the pandemic on a more regular basis, and I began to realize they actually come in the yard when I'm in sort of an enclosed space doing a bit of exercise. And I finally figured it out the other day. I watched the cats in the neighborhood come through the yard until I'm out there, and then they leave. And when the cats leave, the birds feel safe. I had no idea of this kind of communicative pathway that was going on until suddenly I caught it, because I was there for about 10 minutes, and it was the wrong time of day, and suddenly the yard filled up with birds. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is what's happening. So these relations to nature, I think we have to open our minds up as to what those are like and how those happen. They don't happen in the way we want to do our kind of plan Francis Assisi kind of moves. I'll be kind and this will happen. I think it's another kind of empathy with the other.
Oh, this intelligence that you're talking about is actually, I want to jump on and ask a little bit about it. And I want to take a kind of a curve there and say, where we're asking about the intelligence of the insects in the context of synchronicity, which is a beautifully interesting question. What if we put that right next to the intelligence of characters that are playing out a story? And, Chris is here, and we've talked about this, and there's always a conversation about the hero. Is the hero the one driving the whole narrative, knows what's going on, ultimately has the authorship to make it happen? But a lot of times, I think that to come into this conversation of the division between subject and object, individual and whole, if the hero represents this striving individual, so often that striving is not at all what results in the success of the story. Sometimes it's used, sometimes it's manipulated, but often the story, the climax of the story, and I think especially great stories right now, are stories that are making that ant bridge, where what's happening is some kind of solution that is emergent, that cannot come from an individualist psyche, that cannot come from a single person trying to solve the problem. And I just think it's really cool to see that example. That ant bridge may be a perfect metaphor, not just for how we might try to live, but also for the type of stories we might be trying to create. Like, what if we start actually working backwards from the creation of stories that encourage us not to put our emphasis on the individual, but on the emergent capacity of the collective?
That's a wonderful idea, Will. It makes me think the stories that have often caught my imagination are the dumbling stories. The third brother, for example, in a fairy tale, the one that is not the brightest or not the most athletic or whatever it is, goes off on a journey and has a kind of empathic kindness and relationship to the world. And that brings things in that otherwise wouldn't happen, that the heroic, egoic kind of conquering perspective can't get to. And I think that there's something about that kind of dumbling psychology that's closer to a synchronistic world. It's a kind of mental state from a story
Or
perspective.
Gump.
Yeah, being there. Yeah.
Thanks. And I would love to, continue to hear people's thoughts about that, because, so many directions to take this conversation, and it's so beautiful to see that we're taking it so many ways. Thank you. And I see Zaman wants to ask us something. So
I really enjoyed the presentation, and was wondering if you can move from the bees to the reptiles. The first word that drew my attention very, very deeply in the very first slide you showed was the word acausal.
Yes.
And as I was thinking about the causality element, where did causality come into existence, at least in Islamic mythology, the word acausal sounds like ekala. And ekala is the serpent-shaped turban that the Arabs wear.
Oh.
And it originates in the myth of the Garden of Eden, where the Quranic narrative is there's no Eve there, so it's a one being. That Adam, the androgynous Adam, questions the reason as to why would God create all these trees and fruits and everything around, and then tell him, okay, tell him or her not to touch, not to approach that one tree. And so Adam looks for a reason, and the reason is comes to him in the form of a serpent that goes to the Garden of Eden. Yeah. And so serpent is where becomes the cause. So he's looking for the cause of why am I not supposed to eat of that forbidden fruit, so to say. Then when you write the word iqala in Arabic, you write it with a loop in the middle, with a knot. And the knot has two significance. One, which I think is more symbolic for whatever reason, is that it is a knot that ties cause with the effect. It can not only connects them, it's the tying them together. So the tying together of the cause and the effect takes the shape of a loop, which is like Ouroboros, which is the serpent, which is the serpent in the Garden of Eden, which is the serpent that brought up the questions of why not eat of the forbidden fruit. Which then, when you pronounce the word iqala, it sounds like acausal, which connects back to your talk. And so it's kind of going back and forth in my head and saying, like, wait a minute, which is it? Is it causal or is it acausal? And of course, if we understand it in terms of bees and insects and serpents and the nature, birds talking to us, then it cannot be necessarily causal, because cause for us, the logos equivalent of Arabic is, again, it's akal, which is iqala, which is the talk, which is the word. So I think there is a whole lot to explore in that sense. Yes, Indo-European languages are not connected with the Semitic languages, so we cannot connect in linguistically there. Mm-hmm. But what is synchronicity? That in the very beginning, the two words that is establishing or at least questioning the causality in the two languages sound exactly the same. And that's what I was thinking. And there it goes right in the very first slide of your presentation. So I think that's a synchronicity by itself, but I would like to hear your comment on it.
Oh, that's absolutely fascinating. I think the braiding of the causal and the effect is really, I mean, as I was listening, that's the thing that struck me the most, that the way we've developed our scientific mind has been to put those in a time sequence in a particular way. When you do the loop, you begin to deconstruct time in that way, you move outside of that. And when you braid cause and effect into a pattern, then I think what you're looking at is a very different nature of reality than what we get when we straighten that all out. The impulse to take the curves out of these things is I think, pretty much the problem. And what about the tree? Of knowledge that we're not supposed to eat from. Is that something about seeing through language in the way that you're talking about it? To really truly know that these are constructions that we use to navigate reality, but then we've in a way lost our way and forgotten that it's linguistic play to create the alternative narrative out there of what we're seeing, rather than the direct experience of what it is that we truly can taste.
And you, in a way, you can also look at it in the cultural context too. That turban the Arabs wear, which is like a serpent around their head, which is the reason on the outside, and then there is a reason, the brain on the inside, and they put the two together. And I don't know how much of that is, again, a coincidence. Culturally, they could have adopted any kind of turban, clothes, whatever to wear. But the shape of the turban they wear is exactly the shape of the Ouroboros, or the serpent, which brought us down here, the cause of our sort of fall in the first place. But again, more opportunities for further exploration, I guess.
Yes, thank you. I mean, in that sense, in the symbolic traditions, oftentimes hair is seen as what comes out of the head, and it's linked to the imagination. And so therefore, not cutting one's hair is to let the imagination really unfold and really get its full expression. And that's something, the question is, what's then our relationship to the imagination as a real organ of experience and knowledge?
Joe, thank you so very much. What an exquisite presentation. I'm going to come at this from a more clinical perspective. Synchronicity certainly illuminates the psychological path forward for a client. But I think not enough is talked about how that interfaces with the therapist and how that opens that up completely. And so not only for the therapist, if you're in a marriage or in a relationship and you're having these synchronistic things, another dimension is opened up. So I think whether it's therapeutically or relational, I think we need to look at how this interface happens in our everyday life. Can you speak more to that?
Yeah, I mean, when these things have happened clinically, it's opened my eyes to a different level of connectedness with the client where that's happened, number one. That's just sort of the first layer of it. It's like, whoa, there's a connection here beyond what I was seeing from the clinical training perspective. It doesn't give us that whole depth of the unconscious to unconscious communication, which links into something larger. But it also, I found over time, if I were giving a clinical presentation, I would give some examples of things that happened and the consequences unfold over 20, 30 years. That it's like these cultural things that unfold. Once these things are established, it's really like an entanglement, from quantum physics. It has that quality that once the particles have engaged with one another, they're connected in a way, unless something's disturbing that. I've had a person I had seen 25 years previous came to mind when I was asked to give a paper on a clinical presentation, and I hadn't asked permission, so I couldn't use it. And 3 weeks later, that person called me for a consultation, and it ended up going directly to what I wanted to talk about. I didn't try to direct it there. And I could just see the power of that, the way in which the psyche didn't belong to that person or me. Jung has this statement that actually when we dream, it's not out of ourself or the other, but what lies between. It's that interactive field between us. And that, I mean, to me, that's the analytic or therapeutic mind, is the field mind, not the kind of individual experience. And therefore, I think this is part of, there's no way to do this without being transformed yourself. You cannot have these kind of clinical experiences without it fundamentally altering who you are, or I don't think much happens. If you're not open to that, then I think maybe you offer a little CBT and on their way they go. So at least that's some first thoughts about that. Thanks.
And Joe, I just want to bring a couple people into the room. Firstly, Voris, who's normally with us, wasn't able to start with us. So hi, Voris. Thanks for joining us when you could make it. And also Becca Tarnas, who gave a presentation with us on the Red Books, which very much touched on some synchronicities just 2 Myth Salons ago. Thanks for joining us, Becca. And I think we're also maybe be inviting in the gentleman who's giving a presentation, Lawrence, on synchronicity at the Jung Institute this Friday. And we'll make sure we share an event link on that below as well. So always cool to see the synergies and synchronicities. And with that, you know, I just wanted to see if Forrest had anything to come in with. I know you came in a little bit after some of the talk, but always love hearing from you.
Thanks. Thank you for the invite. I was going to remain quiet, but what I heard, I do have a question. In terms of this relationality, as it relates to not only the psyche, but as it relates to quantum physics. I really like what you have to say about the cats and they're leaving and you're being unaware of that. And in the academy, you have folks like Deleuze and Guattari and some others who are arguing for the radical relationality of the universe. And that indeed it is in those in-between internecine spaces that life's, the meaning can be experienced. Is that kind of what you're getting at? Or are you arguing something differently?
I think that's a pretty important point of it, because again, it's the mutual constructions of these things. From a clinical perspective, it's the quality of this is just so much. It's just radically different when it's an engagement with somebody else, and the feeling of kinship and of knowing one another. I mean, it isn't knowing all the details about somebody, but it's a sense of there's a kind of transparency and a being with that's I find extremely powerful. And just to trigger one thing, when I had that experience with the woman with the black forest, we never discussed it. I never even mentioned it, but within 3 months, she started dreaming of being underwater and kind of then in a bit of panic and dreaming I would show up with tanks of oxygen and do buddy breathing. If you're a diver, you share that. So her psyche got it at a deep level. I was just so taken by the wisdom in that client who was struggling with all kinds of very painful, difficult traumas. And yet something in her had the intelligence to really grasp at a very deep level and really hold me in a way, it's like, we're both in this. We're both in the drink. I may be providing certain resources, but I'm also undergoing something here myself. And so it's that relationality for me where the transformational value of the synchronicities happened.
I just want to point out, we are going to have so many more questions than we can possibly get through on synchronicity. It's one of those flowers. It's like the golden lotus of the Nile that just keeps opening a new flower every day. And so would love to just make sure everybody knows that on the event page for this, there's going to be a place where any ongoing conversation can continue to happen. So just want to make sure everybody knows about that. And with that, I just want to invite Becca in. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for bringing me in here. I wasn't expecting to join the panel. I have to just share what brought me here tonight, because I'm currently teaching at Pacifica the course on synchronicity that was originated by Dr. Cambray and Kieran LaGrace. And so last week, I was deep in composing my lecture based on your book, Synchronicity. And I was right at the end, starting to feel a bit tired. And I was like, I'll take a little break. I'll check my email. I shouldn't check my email. I should finish this. I checked my email. Top email that just came in, subject heading says, how synchronistic that you should be seeing this. I open it up and there's the announcement for this event with the cover of Joe Cambray's book right there, the copy of his book open on my desk. They're just right next to each other. So it was just this beautiful affirmation and there was no way I could miss this.
One of the things we didn't get to was the last two events. We've talked about books falling off shelves and hitting people on heads. So thanks for making sure that one made it in this time.
That's great. I don't want to take up too much time at the ending here. So maybe this is just a drop to put in that can ripple into later conversations. But in exploring synchronicity as an acausal connecting principle, one thing that keeps coming to mind from my philosophical background is leaping back to more than 2,000 years to Aristotle, who spoke about multiple forms of causality, not just material and efficient, which is what we see represented in classical physics, but formal causality, as we see represented in Rupert Sheldrake's morphic fields, or final causality, which implies a teleology. And I would be curious if anyone has any thoughts on these two other forms of causality, if it makes sense for us to reintroduce them into the discussion of synchronicity, and then is it really acausal or is it a different form of causality? I know it's a huge topic.
Yeah. Well, you're right to deconstruct our more restricted visions of causality. I think that and that model of causality that we have is again an energetic, mechanistic model. That's really what's behind it. And these other aspects, the formal and the final, really have something to do with sentience and life itself as a part of what's giving shape and form to all of this. And I think that's part of the mystery that's not going to get solved by the kind of science that we've had up to date. That's more and more evidence philosophically, you know, that's a dead end for us. We've been trying and trying and trying, and we don't solve that. So I think, how do we begin to take those kinds of conceptions of causality and really take a deep dive into them and reimagine them? It's a wonderful project.
You know, Lawrence, thanks for joining us. And I know that speaking of, if you have more interest in synchronicity and want to go further into it, I know there's an event literally tomorrow night at the Jung Institute. So, Lawrence, wondering if you've had any reflections listening to Joe tonight.
Okay, well, thank you, Joe, and greetings from Australia, where we've had virtually no coronavirus.
Yes, I know. Yeah,
totally free where I am in Queensland, and we've had 7 deaths in the huge state. But looking at coronavirus, it struck me that this is an unbelievable cultural synchronicity, because without it, Trump would have been re-elected and there'd be no hope for the environment. Instead, we have hopefully FDR Jr. And if you have any reflections on this, I would love to hear it.
Yeah, well, it starts with the kind of the models of climate change that are beginning to emerge. Where does this, you know, if we get past the it was invented in a lab fantasy, which is what it is, an attempt to create more Asian hate that Dana was touching on at the beginning. In fact, there's pretty good evidence that what's happening is, as the planet's heating up, animals who are in the tropics are going to higher latitudes to retain livable environments, and they're getting into engagement with species. These are chance engagements with species that migrate that they normally wouldn't be encountering. And so we're creating new encounters by that. And this is where you get opportunistic viruses that hop.
cross species. And it's very clear to me when you look at that research that if we don't pay attention to coronavirus, we're going to have a lot more of this. This is not this was once in a century in the past. This is going to be more frequent. This is going to be our future. So this is a part of it. And we need to really grapple with that. I mean, in a way, there's all kinds of strange silver linings with this. As you pointed out, the political aspects, there's been a new kind of ecological awareness that the pollution has dropped with the air travel going down. And part of it is what do we do with it? You know, it's a psychoid phenomenon, as I mentioned at the beginning. Viruses are these very strange organisms that are right at the edge between living and not living. You can crystallize them. And they've done this with the coronavirus. You can crystallize it, put it into a jar and put it on a shelf, and just leave it there for 10 years and then bring it into solution, and then boom, it's live and active. And that kind of at the edge of this, where something could be psychic, animated, or not, says that we've got a psychoid phenomenon. That's what we're unleashing in this. And that tells me, well, that's what Jung said was it's a psychoid archetype that's activated when you have a synchronicity. So I read the corona situation as a global synchronicity that's going on. And how do we then stand in relationship to that? What meaning are we going to make out of that? So are we just going to return status quo ante? I certainly hope not. I mean, certainly it's driven us into, just think about what's happening here. We're all in these different spaces simultaneously. Nobody's psyche was evolved to see 15 different rooms simultaneously, different time zones, different lighting, different sounds. Our psyches are not adapted to this. We're creating another kind of cyber reality that wasn't there before. Where that will lead us, I don't know. But I think there's something synchronistic about this moment. And I think it's about being at an edge of, this may be one of the last moments where we can save ourselves as a species. If we need to be conscious of our impact on the globe, or like with the bee, if you don't feed it honey, you're going to get stung. If you feed it honey, if you start to pay attention to what's going on and become empathic with this creation, hopefully something new can come. But I don't know, it gets my ecological mind going. So
thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think there's a whole link between ecology and synchronicity.
Well, it does, Joe, seem to be pointing us to the toll booth to pay the huge price that our separation from the natural world has created for us. That we are now all stuck in our isolated rooms, trying to do our best to communicate as a collective and to overcome the natural impulses to come together. It's the best we can do under the circumstances. And you can see the impulses just going wild in the culture as everybody is chomping at the bit to get back to work, to get back to congregate, to do everything. And it doesn't, to me, appear that we've really solved the issue or compensated effectively for the nature of the coronavirus. So I'm struck by, we're paying the price of having separated ourselves from the entirety of oneness by launching into, as I think it was Susan Bordeaux, creating separations between subjectivity and objectivity. When everything was oneness, there was a condition where synchronicities would have been more or less normal because that's the way in which reality behaves. It's as if the Tao is having its manifestations and we are just one with the Tao. So I am deeply appreciative with Will that you responded to our invitation to come on here. And I really want to thank Christoph, and I want to thank Chris Vogler. Lawrence, thank you. I didn't mean to out you by coming on here. I saw your name was on there and I said, oh my goodness, look at who we have here tonight. Is this really cool? And Becca, thank you for joining us. Zaman, Selena, Dennis, Boris, what a great evening. I mean, we are, as we're going forward, we have a meeting among ourselves as panelists to discuss the largeness or smallness or what's appropriate for the Myth Salon and how we're going to structure the panel in the future. But I think we're seeing one of the virtues of a large panel when we get this many quality educators on here and these minds. I mean, this has been a fabulous, fabulous evening for us, Joe, and I thank everybody for being part of it. However, against the backdrop of the talk, what I would like to do is go out with a moment of silence. So if you'll please reflect momentarily, please let's listen to this. I'll never figure out how to get this thing properly situated. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for attending another Myth Salon, for making this such a viable part of our community at Pacifica and otherwise. I love everyone. Thank you so much. And Joe, Lawrence, Christoph, Chris Vogler, everybody, all my friends and loyalists as panelists, I could do this forever. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you, Joe.
What a rich evening with all of you. I just gained so much from it.
Yeah.
Thank you all for your contributions.
Just beautiful. Thanks.
Gives me a wonderful sense of something marvelous to play with. This is something, I just have that feeling. This is a source of play, and I think Jung found that late in his life, that these are things to play with.
Yeah, and you all contributed to making the field active and alive. So thank you all.